Welcome to Studies with Stearman. Join us as we look deeper into the Bible. Strengthen your faith with us, even as we see the day approaching. And now, here's Gary.
We are in the Olivet Discourse, so called because Jesus is seated on the Mount of Olives, at least in one part of this dissertation, probably at the peak of the Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley to the Temple Mount, which was a 24/7 hustle and bustle of activity. People came from all over the world to the temple. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. People traveled from all over to see it, not only Jews, but Gentiles, because of the structure. The construction was fabulous. Now it's just a pile of rubble, essentially. But then it was a fabulous center of spiritual activity. So Jesus is speaking from the Mount of Olives, which is a prophetically important position because the Mount of Olives is the place to which he will return when he comes back again. And we're going to look at that a little bit later as recorded by Zechariah. Matthew 24. Now we had gone through Matthew 24, 4 through roughly 35. And we talked last week about the fig tree. The fig tree is typical of Israel, also a symbol of Israel. It's both a symbol and a type, and it metaphorically represents Israel. We looked last week at Jeremiah's prophecy concerning figs. I'm going to reread verses 32 through 35, Matthew 24. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender, putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. So, likewise, ye, when you shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. And the it is, in the Greek language, a masculine pronoun, which should correctly read, know that he is near, even at the doors. Well, we have this in the book of Revelation, where Jesus said, behold, I stand at the door and knock. And that is a prophetic figure. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Have you noticed lately that Jesus is being ridiculed publicly? There are 2 or 3 cartoon series that are weekly or sometimes daily, situation cartoon series that lately have brought the figure of Jesus into their cartoon scripts, essentially make him look like a bumbling fool. They have him saying all kinds of outrageous things. There is a decreasing respect for his words. I take it that when Jesus speaks, it is God speaking, period. That is less and less a viable idea in our day. We don't have respect, we don't have awe, a sense of honor, a sense of, to use the Latinate, the sense of the numinous. That's a wonderful word. The word numinous means the feeling that God is present, a feeling that the Spirit of God is in the near vicinity. Numinous. The sense that God hovers over, say, the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. is almost entirely missing. There was a time, I think, when God's covering spirit in this world was palpable. I've lived long enough to see this great change take place. Well, when Jesus is talking about this generation in verse 34, he's talking about 2 things. He's talking about the generation of the 12 tribes. That is, he's talking about a genetic situation that is prophetic in nature. All through the Old Testament, God promises that he will preserve the 12 tribes and that he will preserve their land. Now, when Jesus says this generation, he uses the Greek term geneo. It's a twofold word. In one sense, it means genealogy or genetic lineage. But in the other sense, it means a group of people alive at a particular time. As Jesus is talking about this generation, he's talking about the Jews. He's not talking about Gentiles at all. The entire context of Matthew 24 is future history for the Jews. So when he talks about the parable of the fig tree, he's talking about the way a fig blossoms and puts on fruit. And a fig is kind of a strange tree. It puts out fruit in miniature form, and then it puts out leaves, kind of a backwards tree. It begins to produce fruit, and then great big leaves grow out, and the fruit ripens. And so the tree should show fruit. You remember Jesus passed by a fruit tree once that was in full bloom, didn't have any figs on it, and he cursed it. This was a type. He was archetypically speaking of Israel not putting on fruit. Because later on, when he begins to talk about fruit, the fruit of the fig tree, that's the part of a fig tree that's really stressed. Its ability to put on fruit and lots of it. So likewise ye, when you shall see all these things, know that he is near. The parable of the fig tree says, when his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. In other words, things are beginning to happen. Summer, by the way, is in the 7 feasts of Israel. Summer is the festival of Pentecost. Pentecost is the time when you gather in the harvest and you gather in the fruit of trees. And the summer fruit is a figure of the second coming of Christ. Go to Micah chapter 7. Micah chapter 7. Micah speaks for Israel. And Micah is prophesying about God's judgment on Israel. And I'll give you time to turn to that as I say that Micah is very much concerned with the idea of ingathering and harvest as a symbol of latter-day prophecy. There are people who say that Israel has been forever put aside. Jesus was incredibly emphatic in saying that Israel would never be put aside, nor would the Temple Mount ever be forsaken in his plan. Micah chapter 7, woe is me, and Micah is speaking for Israel. He's speaking as an Israelite. For I am as when they have gathered the summer fruits. As the grape gleanings of the vintage, there is no cluster to eat. My soul desired the first ripe fruit. He is talking about the festival of harvest, and he's talking about fruit. In essence, he's talking about Israel. And in context, he's talking about the regathering of Israel in the latter days. And he says in verse 2, the good man is perished out of the earth. The word perish in Hebrew is avad, which means to disappear. You know, it just means to, like, now you see it, now you don't. Avad means to disappear. Avadinu, we're gone, we're out of here. It's the Hebrew avad, disappear. The good man has disappeared out of the earth. There is none upright among men. They all lie in wait for blood. They hunt every man his brother with a net, that they may do evil with both hands earnestly. The prince asketh, and the judge asketh for a reward, and the great man, he uttereth his mischievous desire. And so they weave it together. In other words, the people that are left on the earth are a bunch of thieving scoundrels, who, by the way, we see in other prophecies, managed to stand up as moral authority. Micah says the best of them is as a briar. The most upright is sharper than a thorn hedge. The day of thy watchman and thy visitation cometh. Now shall be their perplexity. And this is the latter-day judgment spoken of by all the prophets, particularly Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. The 12 minor prophets each have a vision of the latter-day judgment. He says, the day of thy watchman and thy visitation cometh. The watchman and the visitation, the idea of this watchman is expressed by the Hebrew word from which it is translated. It's mitzafaneach. Mitzafaneach, the watchman. And in that word is a fascinating idea. It's one of those Hebrew compound nouns. And if you analyze it, it means the watchman looks to the north and he sees the enemy coming. All in that one word, mitzafaneach. Well, the whole Bible is riddled with prophecies about a latter-day northern invasion of Israel. And so when Micah is talking about when they have gathered the summer fruits, he's really talking about that period of time when Israel is threatened, deeply threatened. Now turn back to a passage that we looked at last week, and I want to review it. It is Jeremiah 30. Jeremiah discusses the same period of time that Micah is discussing. Jeremiah 30 is talking about a period in which there's great distress in national Israel. Ask ye now, Jeremiah 30, verse 6, and see whether a man doth travail with child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in travail? A prophetic metaphor of a man having labor pains, which is an odd metaphor. But Jeremiah uses this to describe Jacob, that is, the 12 tribes. All faces turned to paleness. Verse 7, alas, for that day, and of course that day is the day of the Lord, is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. This comes on the heels of Jeremiah's prophecy about the figs of all things. The 24th chapter of Jeremiah is all about figs. This prophecy goes all the way into the latter days. And Jeremiah gives the figure of Israel as 2 baskets of figs. One basket is good figs, and the other basket is rotten figs. They're so rotten you can't even eat them. You don't even want to eat them. The good figs, the Lord says He's going to bring them back again to the land. Jeremiah 24:6, for I will set my eyes upon them for good. I'll bring them again to this land. I will build them and not pull them down. I will plant them and not pluck them up. And as I've said many times, what do you get when you plant a fig? You get a fig tree. Verse 7 says, I'll give them a heart to know me, that I am the Lord. The bad figs, and the Lord is saying, in effect, yes, there are the 12 tribes, yes, there are the Jews, but there are good ones and there are bad ones. And history tells us that indeed that's true. And not just history, but an observation of the present situation. He says, and as the evil figs, which cannot be eaten, they're so evil, surely, thus saith the Lord. And skipping to verse 9 of chapter 24, and I will deliver them to be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth for their hurt, to be a reproach and a proverb, a taunt and a curse in all places whither I shall drive them. So good figs are going back to Israel, the bad figs are going to be scattered all over the world. What could be clearer? I mean, it's just crystal clear. And then again, by way of review, and I want to make sure we get this, Jeremiah 30 talks about the restoration of the Jews to the land. Jeremiah 31 talks about the restoration of the land itself. God says in Jeremiah 31:8, behold, I'll bring them from the north country, gather them from the coasts of the earth, and with them the blind and the lame, the woman with child, and her that travaileth with child together. A great company shall return there. The context is seen in Jeremiah 30, verse 24. The fierce anger of the Lord shall not return until he have done it, until he have performed the intents of his heart. In the latter days ye shall consider it. Now the figs, the good figs that go back to the land, are going to go back in what Jeremiah refers to as the latter days. In the latter days. B'yomim acharim. In the latter days. The last days. The last days of what? Well, Jesus said in Matthew 24, in answer to the disciples' questions, and that's what we're talking about now, Jesus said, then shall these things happen. And when Jesus says then, he's talking about those latter days. Now, it takes a while to absorb the concepts of prophecy because they're interwoven and they are complex. Heavy going. You remember last week, we looked at the close of Jeremiah 31, which is the restoration of Israel, Judah, the new covenant that God makes with the house of Israel. And then in Jeremiah 31, 35 through 40, and we read the whole thing last week, the Lord says, I swear by the created universe which I have made. Number one, the seed of Israel shall be preserved. That's the 12 tribes of Israel. And number two, Jerusalem shall be preserved as the capital of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, Jeremiah 31:35, which giveth the sun for a light by day, the ordinance of the moon, the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The Lord of hosts is his name, the Lord of armies. If those ordinances depart from me, then the seed of Israel shall also cease from being a nation. So if you want to destroy the Jews, you have to destroy the sun, moon, and stars. That's what God is saying. It's very simple. In the same passage, he lays out a tract of land. It's bounded by the Tower of Hananeel, the gate of the corner, the hill Garev, the hill Goat, the brook Kidron, the horse gate, and the gate of the corner, or the corner pinnacle. If you trace that out on a map, he's tracing Zion, which is in the center of downtown Jerusalem. And he's saying, if you want to take that as your own, if you want to destroy it for your own purposes, first you have to get rid of the sun, moon, and stars. So God is very explicit about that. Now, back to Matthew 24. Learn a parable of the fig tree. Figs. You plant a fig tree, you get figs. When his branch is yet tender, it putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. Now, a lot of people, and this goes all the way back to Dr. DeHaan, and it goes all the way back to C.I. Scofield, 1909. It goes back to the Zionist movement that was founded in 1897. It goes back to the first Zionist Aliyah in 1878. It goes back to George Wygram, John Nelson Darby, and they all, and by the way, they were considered very controversial in their time, they all said, the way we read the Bible, it looks like Israel is going to go back to the land and become a nation. And in the 19th and early 20th centuries, people thought they were nuts. They thought the people were absolutely crazy. Why would you do that? Why would you say that? Because the institutional church had always taught that Israel had been forever set aside and that the institutional church would then perfect the world. That was their eschatology. But God clued in a lot of people at the proper time. And they all began to say, we see the fig tree beginning to put forth leaves. And from this we know that summer is nigh. What do you do in the summer? You gather the summer fruit, which is an idiom for the second coming of Christ. When he comes, he's going to come and gather the fruit. Jesus says in Matthew 24:34, verily I say unto you, this is in the middle of the fig tree dissertation. He says, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. This generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Psalm 48:13, which is a prophecy, says, concerning Jerusalem. It really speaks to the archaeologists, and if we had time to read all of Psalm 48, it's an address by David to the archaeologists who would study Israel in the latter days, and particularly Jerusalem. And he says, mark ye well her bulwarks, that is, her structural underpinnings. Consider her palaces, that you may tell it to the generation following. To the generation following, Lador Acharon, the last generation in Hebrew. David says there will be a last generation. He calls it a last generation. Psalm 48:13. In Psalm 102:18, there's a psalm written for the generation to come, which in Hebrew is Hador Ha'aharon, the last generation. King James translators translated the Hebrew, the generation to come. It really says the last generation. Psalm 102:18 says, this shall be written for the last generation. The people which shall be considered shall praise the Lord. Psalm 109:13, speaking of an evil man who will attempt to rule in Israel. We read this prophecy written by David. Let his posterity be cut off. In other words, let him be without genealogy, without successors. And in the generation following, let their name be blotted out. Well, you look at that in the Hebrew, and again it says, Lador Acharon. So it really is saying, let his posterity be cut off, and in the last generation, let their name be blotted out. This last generation idea is not a strange idea to the Jews, nor was it a strange idea to the disciples of Christ as he sat there talking to them. They all knew these Psalms. They all knew about the prophecies of the last generation. Jeremiah had written long before. David had written 1,000 years before. Ezekiel had written centuries before. They all knew the prophets, and they all knew about the prophecy of the last generation. When Jesus says, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass, they knew exactly what he was talking about. He was talking about Lador Acharon, the last generation, or he was speaking to the last generation. Psalm 78:6, that the generation to come, the last generation, might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. So Jesus says, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Now, he's saying two things. He's saying the Jews will be preserved. Arnold Fruchtenbaum wrote a book years ago. I don't know how many copies are left because it was not widely consumed, but I have a copy. The title of the book is How to Destroy the Jews. Well, Arnie is one of the great Messianic Jews, as far as I mean, he is a Messianic Jewish teacher of the first water, and brilliant, I should say. So he wrote this book, tongue-in-cheek, saying, here's how to destroy the Jews. And he goes through all the attempts to destroy the Jews. Over and over and over again, there have been attempts to destroy the Jews. The Persians tried to destroy the Jews, and the Assyrians tried to destroy the Jews, and various people, the Arameans, and on and on and on. There have been attempts to destroy the Jews, and each time a nation has tried to destroy the Jews, they have received the exact fate that they attempted to inflict upon Israel. How to destroy the Jews? Well, Jesus says, this generation shall not pass. This generation is going to be preserved, is what he says, until all these things be fulfilled. What are these things? Well, he continues to talk. The context here is the second coming of Christ. We have just read his words up above, in the passage above, starting in Matthew 24:30. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. They shall see the Son of Man coming in clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. They shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now this sounds unbelievable. We are, after all, at the pinnacle of enlightenment, right? We are the scientific generation. And our leaders have suggested that through science we're going to rise to greater heights than ever before. It is, after all, science that makes us a quality generation. Better living through chemistry, right? Science. Science is going to save the world. It's going to keep the globe from warming, the seas from rising. It's going to keep us from using all that oil, which, as we all know, we're just about to run out of that. It's going to keep us from using anything that would generate carbon, which is lethal, of course. Don't get me started, but science says that it's going to save us. That, by the way, is a religious term. You ever hear about getting saved? Yes. From what? From the slavery to a false system of idolatry. That false system of idolatry is being touted right now as science. Science believes in what it calls uniformitarianism. That is to say that you can go back millions of years and go through the layers of rock and examine this, that, and the other thing, and you'll discover a kind of a uniform set of conditions over time. In other words, the earth has not radically changed according to science, but rather it maintains itself. it almost has the capacity to heal itself. Some scientists have almost referred to Earth, and this is the Gaia principle, the goddess principle, as a self-healing, feminine, or highly intelligent Mother Nature. And woven through science, there's this idea of the woman, who's protecting herself. Well, that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, or the Etruscans for that matter, and the Greeks and the Romans, who believed in the goddess as the savior of the world. Well, we've boiled it all down in our generation to don't mess around with Mother Nature, right? But science is going to save us. And so there's this doctrine of uniformitarianism that says the world has pretty much been the way it is right now, and it's pretty much going to be the way it is in the future, and our science is going to make sure of that by keeping systems regulated and not allowing the climate to get out of control and so forth and so on. Then you read Matthew 24:29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. They shall see the Son of Man coming in clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Do you believe that is actually going to happen? I do. Throw mud at me, whatever. I believe it. Verbatim. It's not scientific, by the way, to say this. This is not scientific. It's not a scientific fact. This is a fact of future history spoken by Jesus, the words of the incarnate Lord God. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. They shall gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to the other. I believe that's going to happen. As bizarre as it sounds, such a thing just couldn't happen, could it? Because we've never seen anything like that happen. The world just goes on day after day. It doesn't change. The Bible says that there's this incredible change coming. Now, turn, if you will, back to the prophet Zechariah. Keep your place in Matthew 24. And turn, if you will, to prophet Zechariah, which talks about the very same thing that Jesus is speaking about when he's speaking to his disciples. Zechariah 14, speaking about the Mount of Olives, where he is seated with his disciples. It was the great meeting place in Jerusalem that Jesus used to meet with his disciples. 14:2, Zechariah. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. That's Revelation 19, by the way. Battle of Armageddon, when the Lord arrives on earth with the armies of heaven and fights against the nations. Do you really believe that that's going to happen? How strange. Could that really happen? The Lord actually coming out of the heavens and fighting against the nations? Bizarre. Boy, would that ever make Fox News? CNN, 24/7. I think it's going to happen. His feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. The Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, toward the east, toward the west. There shall be a very great valley. Half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, half toward the south. And this is the part that I wanted to get to. Ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azal. The Jews, as given in Revelation chapter 12, are going to flee for their very lives. We are going to look at Jesus' prophecy of that in just a moment, as he gives it in Luke chapter 21. There will come a point. The Jews have been regathered into their land. God says he will never forsake them, nor will he forsake the land. However, for a brief period of time, in the middle of the time of Jacob's trouble or the Great Tribulation, they're going to have to run for their lives into a hiding place. Zechariah calls it the valley of the mountains. Verse 5, and ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains. For the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azal. Now, you can't find this on a map. It's a hidden place. And why would the Lord, give away the hiding place? He wouldn't, because the enemy would just read the Bible and go get them. They're going to flee to some unknown hiding place. It says, yea, ye shall flee like as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee. And we read about that, of course, in Revelation 19, Isaiah 29, Joel chapter 3. We don't have time to look at all the corresponding references. Now here's the interesting thing that I wanted to point out to you. And it shall come to pass in that day that the light shall not be clear nor dark, but it shall be one day which shall be known to the Lord, not day nor night, but it shall come to pass that at evening time it shall be light. You realize what's being spoken of there? This is the glory of God. In John talks about how light came into the world and the world did not perceive it. When Christ incarnated the first time, all things were made by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life. Life was the light of men. And light shineth in darkness, and darkness comprehended it not. When he came the first time, his light was not comprehended. That is to say, people didn't recognize him as a being of light. They thought he was just plain old Jesus, the son of the carpenter, lived up there in Nazareth, had calloused hands, sweat on his brow, worked hard. That was Jesus. Just a man, great teacher. That's the way the world sees him. But he was really a being of light. The world did not comprehend it. However, Zechariah says when he comes the second time, he's going to come as a being of light. It shall come to pass in that day, says Zechariah, that the light shall not be clear nor dark. What is that light? That is the primeval light, which we often refer to, the light beyond time and space. It is the light of Jesus, or as the Hebrews call it, the Shekinah glory of God. Shekinah, which means light dwelling in human flesh, or light beaming into this world. When the old preacher under the tent says, "Brethren, have you seen the light?" Well, what's he talking about? He's using a figure of speech like, have your eyes been opened to the truth of God? But I would go one step further than the tent preacher, and I would say, have you seen the light beyond time and space? Have you seen the light that the only way you can perceive this light is to break through the time-space continuum, which takes some heavy-duty physics and a lot of positron energy, the way I understand it, unless you're the Lord, and he's already done it. The light, the Shekinah glory, is going to characterize that day. It shall come to pass in that day, says Zechariah, that the light shall not be clear nor dark. In other words, it's going to be an indescribable light. In that day, people will really say, have you seen the light? Wow! The light of God, it's not going to look like the light of the sun, which is radiation. It's not going to look like the light of the moon, which is reflection. It's going to look like something nobody's ever seen before. It's going to be the Shekinah glory of God, but it shall be one day which shall be known to the Lord. Only the Lord knows that day. And we're going to get into that because you remember back in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says, no man knows the day or the hour, but the Father in heaven. It shall be one day which shall be known to the Lord, not day nor night. In other words, it's going to be a funny kind of a day. Maybe even time itself will be suspended. We don't know. He has the power, actually, to do that. He did it once, if you'll recall. He actually stopped the course of the sun in heaven and reversed the course of the sun in heaven. He can do that. And it shall be in that day that living waters shall go out from Jerusalem, half toward the former sea, half toward the hinder or the western sea. Summer, winter, it shall be. So the coming of the kingdom is going to be marked by geophysical changes unlike the world has ever seen. We're living in a generation that is absolutely obsessed with geophysical stability. Oh, we're destroying the planet. If this keeps up, the sea level is going to rise by 6 inches, by the year 2013 or something. Temperatures are going to go out of control, and there'll be so much ozone in the air that we won't be able to breathe. The carbon dioxide level is going to rise to contaminate the atmosphere and so forth and so on. People are worried about the environment. I'm not worried about the environment because over and over again the Bible says the one who created the environment is coming back. He's going to tune it up. and he's going to bring new systems into operation that nobody has ever seen or heard of. So I'm not worried. I'm just not worried. So Jesus is talking about this in the context of the parable of the fig tree. He says, "Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, my words shall not pass away." What do we see at the very, very last of the book of Revelation? Where John said, "I saw a new heavens and a new earth, for the former heavens and earth had passed away." In other words, there's going to be a complete restructuring of the universe. Can you believe that? Wow. I mean, really, can you believe that? I have a friend, by the way, who's an astronomer. And he works at McDonald Observatory. He works at Cerro Tololo in Chile. And he works in Mauna Kea, Hawaii. He's a first-rate scientist. Works at the largest telescopes in the world. And he is a stark, raving, mad, loony, fundamental Christian who believes in the coming of Christ. Well, you can imagine how the conversations go up there at the observatory on those long nights, because his fellow astronomers are really, they're scientists. And they don't believe in all this at all. They just don't. And so he leads an interesting life. He actually believes in the second coming of Jesus and that the environment's going to be changed. It's going to be restructured. Well, that is anathema to a scientist, because a scientist reserves that unto himself. We scientists are going to save the world. I just can't stop talking about this because that's what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about what he's going to do to bring justice to the planet, to restore the broken environment, not just of the earth, but also the heavens. Now we get to an interesting segment of prophecy. Matthew 24:36, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man. No, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." Or Zechariah said it's a day known to the Lord. "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came, took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Do you believe in Noah's ark? And if you do, then you have to believe something else. You have to believe that waters covered the surface of the earth to float the ark. Uh-oh. I mean, could any such thing have really happened? Or is that an ancient fiction dreamed up by tribesmen around a campfire after a rather huge flood, which they thought covered the entire earth, but it was really only in their district? And they made up this story about a guy who was floating by on a log with a few animals, but they expanded it into an ark and all the animals on earth. So it's really a fiction, right? I mean, do you really believe Noah's ark and all the animals and things like that? I mean, do you really believe that? I do. Throw mud at me, whatever. I believe that. In fact, I think that there's very good evidence that now we have found Noah's ark. I've talked with 2 people that have been there. It's not at Mount Ararat in Turkey. It's in northern Iran, of all places. Bits and pieces of the ark have been brought back, some of them tested at the Smithsonian. One chunk, about the size of a large loaf of bread, was sent to the Smithsonian, and they sliced it up into microscopic slices. And in this one chunk, which they identified as animal detritus, they found fur samples and feather samples from 27 different animals, ranging from tropical to Arctic. And they told the gentleman who gave it to them that this sample, which by the way was petrified, this sample could only have come from some kind of an animal stable where there were a lot of animals kept, but it was a curious mix of animals from all over the world, as far ranging as from South America to northern Canada to Siberia. The Smithsonian people said, "Where did you get this rock?" And by the way, they didn't believe in the story of Noah's Ark. But they told the gentleman in question that this sample of petrified animal debris. You might call it mucking out the stables. Petrified animal debris with animal samples from 27 different animals could only have come from the bottom of some place where a lot of animals were kept in close confines for a period of time. Anyway, that's another story. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Okay? How were the days of Noah? People were building fires and, cooking, hunting. How were the days of Noah? Well, the days of Noah were marked by raging, out of control, insane social chaos. We tend to look at those days through rose-colored glasses, biblically. We tend to look at them as, well, history doesn't say much about those days, and all we know is that from Adam to the flood, people lived in a certain way, and they died in a certain way, and things must have been relatively peaceful up until the flood. But in Genesis chapter 6, God describes it in the Torah. It came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair. They took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bare children unto them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And Josephus, the historian, commenting on the Torah, says that these were the Greek gods referred to in the Torah. Mighty men of old, men of renown. And those Greek gods would be people like Zeus and Apollo and other demigods that, according to the Greeks, absolutely controlled the progress of things in the old world. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Okay? Just reading that much and going back to what Jesus said. Jesus said, as the days of Noah were, so also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. In other words, there's going to be a cycling back to the way it was in the days of Noah. What does the Bible say about the days of Noah? Every imagination of the thoughts of the heart of man were only evil continually. We're getting close to that kind of a culture now. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. The Lord looked down on this mess, and he was extremely sad. He was disturbed. And by the way, the Bible speaks of the Lord as an emotional being. He's sentient, but more than that, he's emotional. He gets angry, he gets sad. Here he's grieved because he sees what men are doing. Not that he was surprised, because God knows the end from the beginning, but he was still grieved because of the way people operate. Have you been grieved by the way people operate these days? It doesn't really surprise you, but you know it's going to happen. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth. In other words, at this point in time, he decides judgment is near. Well, the same thing's going to happen one more time. As the days of Noah were, so also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. I want to suggest something to you here. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark. Who is this they? Well, there were giants in the earth in those days. And they saw the daughters of men that were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. What? You mean These B'nai Elohim, heavenly beings, came down and saw daughters of men, and they took wives. Could they be the ones Jesus is talking about who were marrying and giving in marriage, and who brought the world to a state of corruption so that only Noah and his family were pure in their genealogy, which is why God chose to save them and bring them to this side of the flood? Do you believe, and I'm going to ask this again, I've been asking this a lot this morning, do you believe that fallen angels actually came down and took wives? I mean, can you believe that? I do. I'm believing a lot of strange things this morning. I don't know whether you've noticed, but I believe that. By the way, I just copied a couple of pages out of Plato, the Critias, page 1299 of Plato's Dialogues. One of these Greek gods was named Poseidon. You may have heard of Poseidon, the god of the sea. Well, here's what Plato says about Poseidon. So it was that Poseidon received as one of his domains the island of Atlantis, and he established dwelling places for the children he had fathered of a mortal woman in a certain place on the island that I shall describe. He begins to describe the place. He says, now there lived on this hill one of the people of this island who had originally sprung up from the earth. Then, in other words, he was a human. His name was Evanor, and he dwelt there with his wife Leucippe. They had an only child, a daughter by the name of Plaito. When this girl grew to marriageable age, both her mother and father died. It was then that Poseidon conceived a desire for her and slept with her. And the story goes on. He builds a huge city for them, the new couple, and for the children. They had 10 sets of twins. And he gave each of his sons names. To the son who was the oldest and king, he gave the name from which the entire island and its surrounding sea derived their names, because he was the first of the kings of that time. His name was Atlas. The island was called Atlantis, and the sea was called the Atlantic, named after him. The race of Atlas increased greatly. Well, I could go on and on and on. I've picked page 1299 and 1300 out of the Dialogues of Plato. If you read all of the Dialogues of Plato, you read the same story over and over and over again. Plato believed that fallen beings from heaven above came down and performed an illegal act, namely they took human wives. Enoch, son of Jared, the sixth from Adam, wrote in his book about this horrific evil which would be judged by the world. When the Lord comes, it's going to be on a day that he'll come with 10,000s of his saints to make war against the nations. By the way, that's what Jesus said. Interesting. It's exactly what Jesus said. And Jude quotes Enoch, saying, behold, he cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all and destroy all the ungodly, to convict all flesh of all the works of the ungodliness which they have ungodly committed, and of all the hard things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Where did all this sin come from, according to Enoch? Well, all this sin came in the days of Jared, when 200 fallen angels, the first contingent of many, many fallen angels, came down via Mount Hermon, which seems to be some sort of gateway of the ancient gods. And they, in all, were 200 who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. They called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And these are the names of their leaders, chiefs of 10, Samyaz, Arikiba, Ramiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Daniel, Ezekiel, Barakael, Asael, Asamaros, Bariel, on and on and on. These are the leaders of the fallen angels as given by Enoch. And all the others, together with them, took unto themselves wives. Each chose for himself one. And then they began to teach men on earth how to do things that the men did not know how to do. They taught them forbidden things, forbidden knowledge from the heavens above, which they brought with them. By the way, Enoch says, and the wives became pregnant and bore giants. Well, isn't that interesting? That's what it says in Genesis chapter 6. How much of a genius do you have to be to figure out that the old world was utterly corrupted by an illegal intrusion from fallen beings above? Azazel, one of the fallen angels, taught men to make swords, knives, shields, breastplates. He taught metallurgy and the art of working metals. By the way, Azazel, a particularly evil fallen angel, gave his name to the scapegoat. Leviticus 16:10, once a year, the Jews drive a goat into the wilderness to carry the sins of the tribes. And supposedly this goat tumbles over a cliff, taking the sins with him. His name is Azazel. The goat. Mondays, the goat. Maybe you've seen the head of a goat. You know? That evil goat. It goes all the way back to Azazel, one of the fallen angels. How much of a genius do you have to be to figure out that something went really, really wrong in the old world? And Jesus came. He came in response to an ages-long prophecy that said that the Son of God was going to inject himself into this world in flesh to right the grievous wrongs that have been done in this place. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Do we see the days now darkening? I could tell you some things, which I'm not going to do. I think they're darker than you know. I know they're darker than you know. That's all I'm going to say. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking. They were eating and drinking. Who's this they? The intruders. Marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and knew not until the flood came. Took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. In other words, nobody had an inkling. Nobody had a clue that this flood was going to come, except for one man. Noah, a man of faith, a man perfect in his generations. We today who study the Word of God stand in the same place as Noah. We know something, and we're waiting for something to happen. We're waiting to be lifted up before the great judgment comes. And we're just like Noah was in his generation. People laughed at Noah. They made fun of Noah. They thought he was an idiot. I talk about the catching away of the church before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Sometimes people look at me like I'm an idiot. What, you believe that? Yes, I do. And many other things.